But I also wanted to bring in the concept of spiritual emergency, because this is, again, coming from Stan Groff, is probably the one who's done the most work on this. But the sense of that we're in a kind of medical paradigm that often pathologizes altered states, often pathologizes spiritual experience. And he came up with the concept of spiritual emergency to talk about anything that didn't, an altered state or a transformational process that didn't really fit into a Western medical model and would often be labeled as psychosis or mania or some of those. And it feels, I've had experiences like that, or I understand a lot of what that feels like. And often what I found that would come up in those spiritual emergencies is a lot of the buried stuff from the past, stuff that I hadn't dealt with from childhood, or stuff that I hadn't dealt with from my upbringing, my conditioning. And it feels to me, especially in the last few weeks, where we see all of this repressed stuff from the American culture, from the British culture, just coming up. It feels to me like the entire culture is in the middle of some kind of spiritual emergency. Would you agree with that? Are you sort of seeing the same kind of patterns?
I would, because in a way, spiritual emergency is the best model you have as an alternate to breakdown and psychosis. I mean, that's kind of what he's saying. He's saying, look, if you have somebody, maybe they're tripping, or maybe they're not even tripping, they're just going through a part of their life, and they start to have these symptoms that conventional science is going to say, or medicine is going to say, oh, they're psychotic or they're bipolar. Groff wanted to say, look, there's another way of framing it. And there was a lot of stuff like that in the 60s and 70s. It was a whole anti-psychiatry moment. There was a whole attempt to reframe difficult altered states as potentially valuable, as even trauma. That's actually a very interesting thing, a very important difference between our era now and that era that people don't talk about enough. That's really key to understand if you're thinking in terms of that connection. And then I'll go on more about now, is in a sense, a lot of people in the 60s embraced trauma as a rite of passage into a new state. So the idea that taking a huge dose of psychedelics is going to tear you apart, it opens up the possibility you walk out on the other side and you've left a lot of stuff behind. A lot of the ideas about having extraordinary experience, enlightenment experience. In fact, that era's whole quest for radical, intense experiences was partly justified because lots of people, people on the street, psychiatrists, people at Esalen, et cetera, had this idea that there was a kind of a cleansing craziness, at the far end of which was the opportunity to reconstruct in a new way. And we don't think that way anymore. We are much more scared about trauma and how trauma, you can't get out of it, or it tears things down. And we're almost on the opposite, where we don't even want to trigger past trauma. And those two differences are very important. They help explain a lot of the ways that contemporary discourse around psychedelics is so different than it used to be. But I think it's also in some ways not setting us up as well as it could be for what we're going through. Because what we're going through, like you say, does have the character of some return of the repressed, or some kind of, now I have to actually look at not just aspects of myself, but aspects of reality. It's like if you've kind of been in your bubble your whole life, and then finally you have the opportunity to really absolutely existentially recognize that you are going to die and you can't layer anything on top of it. That is a traumatic experience, or can be. It can also be an illuminating experience. And there can be illumination in the trauma, and it gets really complicated. One of the things that I'm talking about with all three of the characters that I write about, and I think one of the things that's sort of unique about my approach, is that a lot of accounts, they will either stress the psychopathology or they'll stress the spirituality. So you take someone like Alan Watts. And Alan Watts comes off as a really groovy, mellow guy who's on top of him and stuff, but his actual life is kind of a mess. And in some ways, he was sort of a dark character, and whatever. It's complicated, but he was an alcoholic. He died of alcoholism. He was a womanizer. He was he had a lot of issues with control or self-control. And so when you start to look at the philosophy, you go, what's going on here? It gets complicated. But most people would either say, some negative biographers would go, oh, he was just a reprobate and he couldn't deal with it, and everything else is just a justification for that. And then a lot of the kind of spiritual New Age thing, they don't think about that. They just talk about his brilliant ideas. But it's a mix. It's on a continuum. And the three guys that I talk about, they all spend time in something like psychosis or something like paranoid pathology. Some quite repeatedly in the case of Philip K. Dick. But they also were spiritual figures. They also had prophetic visionary experiences that had integrity and consequence and richness. They also all reflected philosophically on things, and that there's a continuum there. And so the fact that there's psychosis in the picture, or the fact that there's social breakdown, or the fact that there is a big uptick in mental disturbance doesn't mean just the whole thing is unraveling. It also means there are other possibilities that are open. And a more positive view of, let's say in the United States in the last few weeks, the extraordinary energy of these demonstrations, which have a different character than the many demonstrations. Throughout my whole life, I've been going to demonstrations, but there's this futility around them. They seem stale. There's something, haven't we done this already? But these are different. There's something else is kind of constellating. So I think spiritual emergency is a great way to look at it. And again, it's also because I do think that in a non-narcissistic way, this is a spiritual opportunity. And I say that because spirituality has been hijacked in the last couple of decades by narcissistic consumerism. Not entirely, but many things that started out at the very least as kind of interesting, playful, creative spaces, yoga in America, whatever, all these things, you could just watch as they became more successful. They allowed people to actually close off and kind of enter into their own little world view and sort of pamper themselves and hide in a way in their hipness or in their whatever it is. And right now it's like, okay, are you guys still into your spirituality? You're still doing your yoga, still doing your practice, still doing your psychedelics, still, doing your celebrations. Well, if you are now, you're either completely disconnected because you're not paying attention to the crisis in the world, or you're having to reconstitute the connections between your practices and the world in a way that I think can actually help both sides of the equation. So we're actually at a point where things that have been sort of absorbed into business as usual, consumerism as usual, narcissistic social media self-promotion as usual, now are like, okay, we're here, actually we can be used in different ways. And one of the ways that happens is that spirituality is a way to get you through spiritual emergency. Another way of saying that is that religion in the broadest sense, particularly religious practices, not so much the ideas or ideology, reading this, your belief about Jesus or whatever, but the practices, the daily practices, the processes of emotion, of how do you process other people, that kind of world, that stuff, is in a way designed to deal with our own psychopathological capacity. It's not that, people make that point. They'll say, oh, look at religion. It's just kind of OCD. Look at those guys. They have their little rituals they do every day. And it's just, it's just sort of a regressive form of behavior. Why don't we look at it the other way, which is actually, that's a way of dealing with our own capacities to go crazy or to lose the plot or to break down or to weep or to, not weeping's bad, but to lose it in terrible nameless grief can't really get out of. And so I feel like our time now is also an opportunity to reframe a lot of these practices as, tools for survival.